There is a harbor on the coast of Israel that has been setting there underwater for around 2,000 years. Storms hit it, earthquakes have hit, ships have smashed into it. The ocean has been grinding against this thing every single second for 2 millennia. And it is still there, intact, holding its shape. Now picture this, a highway overpass in the Midwest, poured in just 1974. It collapsed last year. Same material on paper, but a completely different result. The reason for that difference? It's sitting right there inside that Roman wall. It's something modern chemists dismissed for over a century, something they literally called a mistake. This video is about that mistake and the pattern hidden inside it that we spent 1,500 years not seeing. Over the next half hour, I'm going to draw it all out for you. The full recipe. 4 ingredients. We're going to walk through each one slowly because the whole story lives in the details. You'll see the volcanic ash the Romans used and why it mattered that it came from one specific Italian town. You'll see the type of lime they used and why modern chemists spent a century using the wrong kind. You'll see why seawater, of all things, made the stuff stronger. And then you'll see the pattern the one chemist walked right past for generations, until a lab at MIT finally turned up the microscope and looked carefully at what everyone before them had called a mistake. This is the story of how a single detail that everyone ignored became the foundation of an empire. And now, a fast-growing industry that's racing to get it back. So, the recipe. The Roman recipe for concrete, on the surface, is simple. 4 ingredients. You can buy versions of all 4 at any hardware store today. That is not an exaggeration. And yet, if you mix them the way modern engineers have been mixing them for the last 200 years, the result is measurably worse than modern cement. So, let's walk through each ingredient on its own, because the secret is not in the list. It's in what the Romans did with each one. Layer 1, lime. Now, this is the word where most modern replications went wrong, because in modern construction, when we say lime, we almost always mean slaked lime. Calcium hydroxide, stable, safe, reactive enough to be useful, calm enough to be handled. The Romans didn't use that. They used the stuff that comes one step earlier, quicklime, calcium oxide. Here's how you make it. You take limestone, which is basically compressed ancient seashells and coral. You heat it in a kiln to around 900 degrees Celsius for hours. The heat drives the carbon dioxide out of the limestone, and what remains is quicklime, a white, porous, chemically aggressive solid. Quicklime is the kind of material you have to respect. Touch it with wet hands, it burns. Add water to it, and it doesn't dissolve. It reacts. The mixture steams. It bubbles. The temperature spikes past 100 degrees Celsius. It looks like it's alive. That's the ingredient the Romans used, not the tamed, domesticated version we use today. The raw one, the one that still remembers the kiln. And this choice, to use the aggressive form of lime instead of the stable one, turns out to be the single most important decision in the entire recipe. We'll come back to why. Layer 2. Volcanic ash. The Romans called it pulvis putiolanus, dust from Puteoli, a specific town on the Italian coast just west of Naples, sitting at the foot of the volcanic field that also produced Mount Vesuvius. That name, Puteoli, is where we get the modern word pozzolana, pozzolanic cement. You've maybe seen it on a bag at the store and not known where the name came from. Here's what the ash actually was. Over millions of years, eruptions in the Puteoli region threw up a very particular kind of powder, extremely fine, extremely porous, full of reactive silica and alumina. The kind of powder that, when you mix it with lime and water, doesn't just sit there, it reacts. The Romans figured out, almost certainly by accident, that this specific regional dust made concrete unlike anything else, stronger, more durable, able to set underwater. And they built an entire supply chain around it. Ships sailed out of Puteoli loaded with the stuff. It got moved across the Mediterranean. A Roman engineer working in North Africa or Turkey or Spain would wait for a shipment from the homeland before pouring a serious structure. For about 1,500 years after Rome fell, Europe forgot that this ingredient mattered. When industrial concrete got reinvented in the 1800s, it was rebuilt around a different chemistry entirely. The volcanic ash recipe was treated as a curiosity. It wasn't a curiosity. It was half the reason Roman concrete outlasted everything that came after it. Layer 3. Aggregate. This one is the most ordinary ingredient in the recipe, and I want to spend just a minute on it, because the Romans did something interesting here too. Aggregate is the big chunky stuff in concrete. Gravel, broken stone, sometimes pieces of brick. It's the bulk filler. In modern concrete, the aggregate is usually uniform, sorted by size, selected carefully for consistency. The Romans used whatever was around. Really, whatever was local. Building a wall in Gaul, you used Gaulish rock. In Egypt, Egyptian stone. But there's a pattern even in this. For the big showpieces, the Pantheon dome, the harbors, the domes of the great baths, the Romans did something sneaky. They used lighter aggregate near the top of a structure and heavier aggregate near the bottom. Pumice and tufa at the top, dense stone at the base, a natural gradient of weight, pouring less load onto the foundations. That single decision lets a dome like the Pantheon stand for 1,900 years without internal steel. Nobody wrote down a formal theory for this. They just did it, structure after structure, until it became instinctive. Engineering ahead of physics. Layer 4. Water. For any concrete you were pouring on dry land, the Romans used fresh water, same as us. But for any concrete that was going in the sea, and there was a lot of that, they used seawater on purpose. This sounds backwards. Modern engineers almost never use seawater in concrete. Saltwater rusts reinforcing steel. It corrodes the chemistry. Every civil engineering textbook tells you to avoid it. The Romans leaned into it. Here's what they figured out without knowing the chemistry. The salts in seawater, especially the chlorides, interact with the lime and the volcanic ash in a way that fresh water does not. The reaction produces different crystal structures, denser ones, tougher ones. Some of them only form when salt water is involved. So for their marine structures, their harbors, their seawalls, their piers, the Romans didn't build despite the sea, they built with the sea. They let the ocean finish curing the concrete for them. 2,000 years later, we're still running away from something they used as a feature. So, now you've seen the recipe. 4 ingredients: quicklime, Pozzolana from one specific town, local aggregate with a quiet gradient trick, and water, sometimes salt. For most of the 20th century, that is exactly where the story stopped. Chemists knew the recipe. They'd read it in Vitruvius. They'd read it in Pliny. They had access to every ingredient. They could walk onto a Roman site, take a sample, run it through any lab technique they wanted, and it didn't work. Every modern replication of Roman concrete, made by chemists using the written recipe and the best technology of their day, produced something weaker than the original. Not a little weaker, measurably weaker. The recipe was complete, and it still wasn't enough. Which means there was something else, something in how the Romans mixed these ingredients, or something in the interaction between them that the written record didn't preserve. For 100 years, that something was sitting in plain sight, and nobody looked at it. Let's go back to the harbor we opened on, Caesarea Maritima. Herod the Great ordered it built around 22 BC on a coastline with no natural harbor, just a flat beach, open sea, no protection. His engineers solved this problem the wild way. They floated wooden boxes out into deep water, filled them with a concrete mix, and let the boxes sink. Those boxes became the foundation of a breakwater that stretched further than 5 football fields end to end. Within a few decades, Caesarea was one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean. The harbor eventually sank. Earthquakes, tectonic movement, sea level change, all of it pulled the city down into the water. You can still dive on the ruins today. Here's what's strange. The city is gone. The buildings are gone. The roads are gone. The concrete breakwater is still there. 2,000 years under a moving sea, and it hasn't crumbled. Now Rome, the Pantheon. Built around 126 AD under the Emperor Hadrian. Its central dome is 43 meters across, unreinforced. No steel inside it, no rebar, no internal cables. It is pure Roman concrete, holding itself up against gravity. For 1,900 years, the Pantheon Dome has been the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. It is still today the largest. We've built bigger domes since. The Dome of St. Peter's, the Dome of the U.S. Capitol, the Hagia Sophia. Every single one of them uses a steel skeleton, or tension cables, or engineered composite panels to help it stand. The Pantheon has none of those. It is a concrete bubble sitting in open air, holding its shape against every force the last 2,000 years could throw at it. And occasionally, a small piece of the interior will fall. A chip, a chunk, And a few years later, if you test the material around the damage, something odd shows up. The surrounding concrete has gotten denser, harder, right at the site of the injury, like the building is responding to the wound. So here's what material scientists started noticing. As they tested more and more Roman samples over the 20th century, modern concrete has a predictable life cycle. It reaches full strength about 28 days after pouring. Then, from that point onward, its strength slowly decays. Water gets in. The steel inside rusts. Micro cracks open. The concrete spalls. 50 to 100 years later, you're demolishing it. Roman concrete shows the opposite curve. The test cores taken from structures in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, all show something strange. The concrete is stronger today than it was when it cured. That is not supposed to happen. A passive, inert material is not supposed to gain strength over 2,000 years of weathering. It should lose strength. It should degrade. But Roman concrete somehow used the weather, the waves, the earthquakes, the damage itself to keep getting tougher. Which means it wasn't passive. It was doing something for 2 millennia in total silence. Now I want to tell you about one of the first people who tried to figure this out. A Yorkshire engineer named John Smeaton. This was in the 1750s, centuries before anyone had the tools to properly analyze the chemistry. Smeaton was hired to build a lighthouse on a deadly rock in the English Channel, the Eddystone Reef. The 2 previous lighthouses on that rock had either burned down or been washed away. He needed a material that could take the sea. He read the Roman text. He studied what little of Roman marine concrete he could find intact. And he became obsessed with this question. Why did theirs last and ours doesn't? He spent years running experiments, mixing limes from different sources, different ratios, different techniques. He eventually produced a hydraulic cement good enough to build his lighthouse, which stood for 120 years before it was retired. But he was the first to admit he never cracked it. He got close enough to build. He never got close enough to understand. And Smeaton was the best anyone did for another 200 years. And here is the detail everyone missed. For the entire time, if you slice a piece of Roman concrete open, anywhere, you see the gray matrix, and you see something else scattered through it, like pebbles through dough. You see these tiny white specks, millimeter-sized, pure lime, all through the material. For over a century, chemists looked at these specks and said one word about them: sloppy. In 2023, a team of researchers at MIT, led by a professor named Admir Masick, decided to take another look at those specks. This was the kind of project that took stubbornness. Sloppy work for over a century. Most of the scientific consensus had moved on. But the Masick lab wasn't convinced. They took samples from several Roman sites. They sliced them down to microscopic thinness. They ran them under a scanning electron microscope at a resolution earlier studies had never used. and what they saw was not what anyone expected. The specks were not unreacted lime. They were not the fossilized evidence of bad mixing. They were something much more interesting. They were a very specific crystal structure, a structure that only forms one way. You only get that crystal pattern if you mix the lime into the concrete while it's still quicklime, while it's still the raw, reactive, aggressive form, not the safe, slaked form, the raw form. Remember, all the way back in layer 1, we talked about the Romans using the aggressive lime. That single decision, this is where that decision pays off. Here is what hot mixing does. When you use quicklime and you mix it directly into the concrete while it's hot and reactive, the lime doesn't all dissolve into the matrix. A small amount of it clumps. Those clumps harden in place as the concrete cures. They become small reservoirs, tiny lime deposits, frozen inside the material, chemically available but physically locked away. And they sit there for years, for decades, for centuries, doing nothing, waiting. That is half of the trick. The other half is what happens when the concrete finally gets damaged. Picture any real concrete structure, a bridge, a wall, a harbor. Over decades, it moves, it flexes, it heats and cools. Stress fractures form, tiny ones, invisible ones at first. In modern concrete, those fractures are the beginning of the end. Water gets into the crack. Steel inside starts to rust. The crack widens. The structure degrades. In Roman concrete, something else happens. Let's walk through what happens in a Roman crack, step by step. This is the healing cycle. Step 1. A crack forms somewhere in the structure. Doesn't matter why. Weather, earthquake, load stress, tiny fracture. Step 2. Water gets into the crack, which in modern concrete is already a disaster. Step 3. The water travels down the crack until it hits a lime clast, one of those frozen reservoirs. Step 4. The clast reacts. Remember, it's still chemically active, just locked up. When water reaches it, the calcium dissolves into the water. Step 5. The calcium-rich water flows through the crack, and as it flows, it precipitates out. It leaves behind a new crystal, a specific one, calcium carbonate, the same mineral that makes up limestone. Step 6. The crystal fills the crack from the inside, seals it. And because the new crystal is denser than the original matrix, the healed crack is actually stronger than the concrete around it. The material scabs. It grows its own stitches out of its own body. And here is the pattern. Because of how the lime clasts are distributed throughout the whole matrix, the material can do this repair trick anywhere. The next crack that forms in a totally different location hits a different clast, and that one wakes up, and that one heals. It's not a one-time trick. It's a distributed immune system built into the material from the day it was poured. Take a second with this, because this is the moment the whole story turns. For over a century, modern chemists looked at the lime specks inside Roman concrete and called them sloppy. Evidence that the Romans were careless. Evidence that the Romans didn't know what they were doing. And because of that belief, every modern attempt to rebuild Roman concrete made sure to eliminate the specks. Clean matrix, no inclusions, uniform mix, which stripped out the exact mechanism that made the original work. The specks weren't evidence of carelessness. They were the entire point. They were the pattern. The Romans didn't necessarily know why it worked. They knew that if you threw aggressive lime into the mix at the right moment, the wall stayed up. For everyone, everywhere, reliably. That is what engineering looked like for them. Trial, error, pattern recognition, over centuries, across an empire, passed from master to apprentice, without a single modern microscope ever in the room. And when we lost them, we lost that, which is, I think, the quiet lesson of this whole story. The past is not a library of outdated answers. It's a library of answers we haven't finished reading. Now I want to show you what this chemistry actually built. Because calling it the mistake that built an empire is not a metaphor. It is a literal description. Start with the harbors. Before Roman marine concrete, most Mediterranean ports were built where nature provided them. A river mouth, a bay, a sheltered cove. If you wanted a port on a coastline that didn't already have one, you were mostly out of luck. Roman concrete changed that. With a material that cured underwater and got stronger over time, Rome could build a harbor wherever it needed a harbor. Caesarea was one. Ostia, the port for Rome itself, was another. Leptis Magna in North Africa. Portus Julius. Dozens of major harbors, most of them built from nothing. All of them feeding a trade network that stretched from Britain to the Red Sea. The empire did not just use concrete for its harbors. The empire was made possible by its harbors. Then there is the architecture. I mentioned the Pantheon earlier, but let me tell you what that building actually represents. In the year 126 AD, Roman engineers built an unreinforced concrete dome 43 meters across. And for the next 1,300 years, nobody on earth came close. It wasn't until Brunelleschi finished the dome of the Florence Cathedral in 1436 that any European architect managed a larger dome. And Brunelleschi's dome was made of brick, with internal chains and a very different structural logic. It wasn't even the same kind of building. For 1,300 years, the Pantheon was untouched. It was a building nobody alive understood how to recreate. Not Byzantine engineers, not Islamic master builders, not medieval masons. Nobody. A single building, standing alone, in a field of architectural history made possible by a concrete chemistry we have forgotten how to write down. And then there are the aqueducts. 11 major aqueducts served the city of Rome at its peak. Together, they delivered over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water to the city. every single day. Think about that number. 1 million cubic meters a day in the 2nd century. Powered by gravity, running through concrete-lined channels that cross deserts, mountains, valleys, and in some places ran underground for 50 kilometers at a stretch. The Pont du Gard in southern France, the Aqua Claudia, the Segovia Aqueduct in Spain. These are not just tourist attractions. They are the infrastructure that made urban civilization at Roman scale possible. And they all rely, at their most critical points, on waterproof concrete that can survive centuries of wet, freeze, and thaw. When the Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the aqueducts stopped being maintained. Many of them stopped delivering water. But the concrete structures themselves, the arches, the channels, most of them are still standing 2,000 years later. You can drive past them today. Pull back for a moment. I want you to see the pattern. An empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, a trade network on a scale no previous civilization had ever run, urban centers of 1 million people, aqueducts, sewers, baths, harbors, domes. All of it depended on a single technology, a specific way of mixing a specific volcanic ash with a specific kind of lime at a specific temperature, poured into a specific shape. A recipe that included a mistake that wasn't a mistake. And when that recipe was lost, the empire's physical infrastructure outlasted its political one by more than 1,000 years. The buildings stayed up after the institutions collapsed. The harbors held after the shipping stopped. The aqueducts stood after the water went away. That is what a good piece of engineering looks like, outlasting the civilization that made it. And that is the end of the story. Except it isn't. Because about 3 years ago, we started bringing it back. Let me describe the present moment. Concrete is the most used human-made material on Earth. We pour more than 30 billion tons of it every year. 2/3 of global infrastructure is made of it. Bridges, dams, airports, tunnels, buildings. And that concrete is failing faster than we can replace it. In the United States, the American Society of Civil Engineers grades the nation's infrastructure at a C-. About 42,000 bridges are rated structurally deficient. The average American dam is over 60 years old. When the Morandi Bridge in Genoa collapsed in 2018, killing 43 people, the cause traced back to concrete corrosion. That had been progressing invisibly for decades. The material we use for our world is built to degrade, and we are paying the bill for that choice now. Which is why, starting almost immediately after the MIT paper came out, something started happening in labs and startups around the world. The Masick team at MIT didn't just publish. They spun out a company, DMAT. Its stated goal is to bring Roman-inspired, self-healing concrete back to market. They focus on coastal infrastructure first, piers, seawalls, marine barriers. Exactly the environment the Romans were building for 2,000 years ago. DMAT is one of several. Biomason uses bacteria to grow calcium carbonate into concrete. Solidia cures its mixes with captured carbon dioxide. Carbon Cure injects captured CO2 directly into fresh concrete. Each of them is reaching for a different piece of the same insight. Make concrete that lasts longer. Make concrete that heals. Make concrete that captures the thing it used to emit. The longest-lived concrete we ever built, we built 2,000 years ago. And in the last 3 years, a handful of companies have been trying, seriously, to unforget how it worked. And here is the reason this is moving so fast. A bridge that doesn't need to be demolished and repoured every 50 years doesn't just save on materials. It saves on labor, it saves on disruption, and it saves on the carbon emissions of every cubic meter of concrete you didn't need to produce a second time. Self-healing, long-life concrete is one of the rare places where the cost argument and the climate argument are the same argument, which is why the money pouring into it right now is not coming from a handful of researchers. It's coming from construction giants, insurers, sovereign funds, every country with an aging dam, an aging bridge, or a coastline that's rising. Step back with me one more time. I want to name the pattern this whole video has been pointing at. The Romans didn't know calcium carbonate crystallography. They didn't know about scanning electron microscopes. They didn't know they had built a distributed, self-healing material. They knew that if you threw aggressive lime into a hot mix, the wall stayed up. That was enough. They built an empire on that sentence. The empire collapsed. The knowledge got filed under legacy, then under curiosity, then under forgotten. For 1,500 years, the pattern was sitting inside a wall in Israel, sitting inside a dome in Rome, sitting inside the arches in southern France, in plain sight. And 3 years ago, a researcher with a microscope finally looked. And the answer that built a 1,000-year infrastructure came right back out of the stone. The past is not empty. The past is a library we keep assuming is empty. It almost never is. If you got something from this video, if the idea of a self-healing wall or a 2,000-year-old harbor or a modern industry being built on a forgotten Roman detail caught your attention, the best thing you can do is subscribe. I'm drawing one of these every week. Every video is a different blueprint. Every blueprint has an echo. One more thing before you go. I took everything in this video, the 4 layers, the lime clast, the healing cycle, and I drew it out as a single printable blueprint, labeled, clean, free. Link is in the description and pinned in the top comment. Next video, every ancient Egyptian cooling system explained. No electricity, no refrigerant, just geometry, wind, and a pattern we are only now starting to notice again. Every blueprint has an echo. I'll see you in the next one.